Chocky continues as read by the bathroom reader. I am covering for the plurality report, who was last seen running into the Paris catacombs while screaming, "Help! Emmanuel Macron is raping this country!" Chapter 4. We were still trying to make up our minds the next Tuesday. That was the day I stopped on the way home to take delivery of our new car. It was a station wagon that I'd been hankering after for some time. Lots of room for everyone, and for a load of gear in the back as well. We all piled in and took it out for a short experimental run before supper. I was pleased with the way it handled and thought I'd get to like it. The others were enthusiastic, and by the time we returned, it was generally voted that the Gore family was entitled to tilt its chins a degree or two higher. I left the car parked in front of the garage, ready to take Mary and me to a friend's house later on, and went to write a letter while Mary got the supper. About a quarter of an hour later came the sound of Matthew's raised voice. I couldn't catch what he was saying. It was a noise, half-choked, inarticulate protest. Looking out of the window, I noticed that several passers-by had paused and were looking over the gate with expressions of uncertain amusement. I went out to investigate. I found Matthew standing a few feet from the car, very red in the face, and shouting incoherently. I walked towards him. "What's the trouble, Matthew?" He turned. There were tears of childish rage running down his flushed cheeks. He tried to speak, but choked on the words, and grabbed my hand with both of his. I looked at the car, which seemed to be the focus of the trouble. It did not appear damaged, nor to have anything visibly amiss with it. Then, conscious of the spectators at the gate, I led Matthew round to the other side of the house, out of their sight. There I sat down on one of the veranda chairs and took him on my knee. I had never seen him so upset. He was shaking with anger, half strangled by it, and still with tears copiously streaming. I put an arm around him. "There now, old man. Take it easy. Take it easy," I told him. Gradually the shaking and the tears began to subside. He breathed more easily. By degrees the tension in him relaxed and he grew quieter. After a time he heaved a great, exhausted sigh. I handed him my handkerchief. He plied it a bit, and then he blew. "Sorry, Daddy," he apologized through it, still chokily. "That's all right, old man. Just take your time." Presently he lowered the handkerchief and plucked at it, still breathing jerkily. A few more tears, but of a different kind, overflowed. He cleaned up once more, sighed again, and began to be more like his normal self. "Sorry, Daddy. All right now, I think." "Good. But dear, oh dear, what was all that about?" Matthew hesitated, and then he said, "It was the car." I blinked. "The car? For heaven's sake, it seems to be all right. What's it done to you?" "Well, not the car exactly," Matthew amended. "You see, it's a jolly nice car. I think it's super, and I thought Chocky would be interested in it, so I started showing it to her and telling her how it works and things." I became aware of a slight sinking, "here we go again" feeling. "But Chocky wasn't interested?" I inquired. Something seemed to rise in Matthew's throat, but he took himself in hand, swallowed hard, and continued bravely. "She said it was silly and ugly and clumsy. She laughed at it." At the recollection of this enormity, his indignation swelled once more, and all but overwhelmed him. He strove to fight it down. I was beginning to feel seriously worried. That the hypothetical Chocky could provoke such a near hysterical condition of anger and outrage was alarming. I wished I knew more about the nature and manifestations of schizophrenia. However, one thing was clear. This was not the moment for debunking Chocky. On the other hand, it was necessary to say something. I asked, "What does she find so amusing about it?" Matthew sniffed, paused, and sniffed again. "Pretty nearly everything," he told me gloomily. "She said the engine is funny and old-fashioned and wasteful, and that an engine that needed gears was ridiculous anyways, and that a car that didn't use an engine to stop itself as well as make itself go was stupid, and how it was terribly funny to think of anyone making a car that had to have springs because it just bumped along the ground on wheels that had to have things like sausages fastened round them. So I told her that's how cars are, anyway, and ours is a new car and a jolly good one. And she said that was nonsense, because our car is just silly, and nobody with any brains would make anything so clumsy and dangerous, and nobody with any sense would ride in one. And then, well, it's a bit muddled after that because I got angry. But anyway, I don't care what she thinks. I like our new car." It was difficult. His indignation was authentic. A stranger would not have doubted for a moment that he had been engaged in a dispute which was not only genuine, but impassioned. Any lingering doubt I may have had as to whether we really needed advice about Matthew was swept away then. However, rather than risk a wrong step now, I kept up the front. "What does she think cars ought to be like, then?" "That's what I asked her when she started on our car," said Matthew. "And she said that where she comes from, the cars don't have wheels at all. They go along a bit above the ground, and they don't make any noise either. She said that our kind of cars that have to keep to the roads are bound to run into one another pretty often, and that anyway, properly made cars are made so that they can't run into one another." "That's quite a lot to be said for that, if you can manage it," I admitted. "But tell me, where does Chocky come from?" Matthew frowned. "That's one of the few things that we can't find out," he said. "It's too difficult. You see, if you don't know where anything else is, how can you find out where you are?" "You mean no reference points?" I suggested. "I expect that's it," Matthew said, a little vaguely. "But I think where Chocky lives must be a very, very long way away. Everything seems to be different there." I said. I tried another track. "How old is Chocky?" "Oh, pretty old. Her time doesn't go like ours, though. But we worked it out that if it did, she'd be at least 20. Only she says she'll go on living until she's about 200, so that sort of makes 20 seem less. She thinks only living until you're 70 or 80, like we do, is silly and wasteful." "Chocky appears to think a great many things silly." Matthew nodded emphatically. "Oh, she does. Nearly everything, really," he added in amplification. "Rather depressing." "It does get a bit boring pretty often," Matthew conceded. Then Mary called us into supper. I found myself increasingly at a loss to know what to do about it. Matthew had evidently had enough sense of self-protection not to tell any of his friends or schoolfellows about Chocky. He had confided in Polly, possibly, I thought with some idea of sharing Chocky with her, but that had certainly been a failure. Yet, quite clearly, he found it a relief to talk about her, and, after the car incident, I had undoubtedly provided a very sorely needed safety valve. Nevertheless, one had the feeling that at most times he was talking circumspectly, as if he were holding himself ready to bolt for cover at any unsympathetic response. The question seemed to be which of several possible courses was least likely to raise his defenses. Mary, when I told her about the car incident that evening, was inclined to favor the straightforward line of asking our regular doctor, Dr. Acott, to recommend a consultant. I was not. Not that I had anything against old Acott. I wouldn't deny that the old boy was an adequate enough pill-pusher, but I couldn't help feeling that the Matthew problem was not in his line. Moreover, I pointed out, Matthew did not like him, so it was improbable that he would confide in him. It seemed much more likely that he would consider we had abused his confidence by mentioning the matter to Acott at all, in which case there was a risk that he would clam up altogether. Mary, upon reflection, admitted the validity of that. "But it's getting to the point where we can't just go on letting it drift. We must do something, and you can't simply pick a psychiatrist out of a list with a pin. You want the right kind of psychiatrist, proper recommendations, and all the rest of it." "I think I may have a line on that," I told her. "I was telling Alan about it the other day, and he mentioned a man I used to know slightly at Cambridge, a fellow called Landis, Roy Landis. Alan knew him rather better, and he's kept in touch with him. It appears that after Landis qualified, he went in for mental disorders. He's got a job at the Clodsley, you know, so he must be some good at it. Alan suggested it might be worth having a try at him, informally, just to give us a lead. If he were willing to have a look at Matthew, he'd be able to tell us whether we ought to consult somebody professionally, and who would be the best man for the job. Or possibly it might be in his own line, and he'd take it on himself. We'd have to see." "Good," Mary approved. "You tackle him then, and see if you can get him to come down. At least we shall feel that we're doing something." Time and professional precept can work wonders. I could scarcely recognize the rather untidy undergraduate I remembered in the well-brushed, neatly bearded, elegant-suited Roy Landis who joined Alan and me at the club for dinner, and I had to admit that these superficialities, plus a responsible manner, go a long way to establishing confidence. There are also somewhat intimidating. I had a slightly uneasy feeling of medical ethics lurking in ambush. However, I plunged in. I stressed that our immediate need was advice upon the best steps to take, and told him something of Matthew. His professional caution relaxed as he listened, and his interest plainly grew. The episode with the new car particularly seemed to intrigue him. He asked a number of questions, which I answered as best I could, beginning to feel hopeful. In the end, he agreed to drive down to Hindmere the following Sunday week. He also gave me some instructions on preparing the ground for the visit, so that I was able to return home to report to Mary with a feeling of relief that, at last, we had things underway. The next evening, I told Matthew, "I had dinner with an old friend of mine last night. I think you might like to meet him." "Oh," said Matthew, not much interested in my old friends. "The thing is," I went on, "we were talking cars, and he seems to have some of the same ideas as you told me Chocky has about them. He thinks our present cars are rather crude." "Oh," said Matthew again. Then, with a steady look, he asked, "Did you tell him about Chocky?" "Well, I had to. A bit. You see, I could scarcely pretend that her ideas are yours, because they certainly aren't." He seemed interested, but not much surprised. Not nearly so surprised as I was when you first told me about Chocky. I rather got the idea he may have run across someone a bit like her before. Matthew showed signs of interest, but he was still cautious. "Someone who talks to him the same way?" he inquired. "No, not to him, but to someone, or it may be more than one person. That he knows. Anyway, as I said, he didn't seem very surprised. I'm afraid we didn't go into it a great deal, but I thought you might like to know." That turned out to be a promising start. Matthew returned to the subject of his own accord a couple of times. Clearly he was more than a little fascinated by the idea of someone who found Chocky unsurprising. It was that, as well as the prospect of reassurance it held for him, I thought, that prompted him to admit that he might like to have a talk with Roy Landis some day. The next Saturday, we gave the new car its first real outing down to the coast. We bathed and picnicked, and then Mary and I lazed in the sun while the children wandered off to amuse themselves. 5:30 was packing up time. Polly was easily found and separated from a gang of young acquaintances, but there was no sign of Matthew. At 6 o'clock, he was still missing. I decided to take a run along in the car to see if I could find him while Mary and Polly stayed where they were in case he should turn up. I had to go right down by the harbor before I spotted him. He was in earnest conversation with a policeman. I drew up nearby, and Matthew saw me. "Oh, hello, Daddy," he called. He glanced up at the policeman and began to move towards the car. The policeman followed and lifted his hand to his helmet. "Good afternoon, sir," he said. "I've just been having to explain to your young man that it won't do." He shook his head and then added, by way of explanation, "You can't expect people to put up with you going exploring on their boats any more than they'd put up with you going exploring in their houses, can you now?" "Certainly not, Constable," I agreed. "Is that what you've been up to, Matthew?" "I was just looking, Daddy. I didn't think anybody would mind. I wasn't doing anything." "But you were on the boat?" "Yes, Daddy." It was my turn to shake my head. "It's not the proper thing at all, Matthew. The constable's quite right. I hope you've apologized." I glanced at the policeman and caught a slight flicker of his right eyelid. "It's right he wasn't doing any harm there, sir," the man agreed. "But it's like you said, not at all proper way to go on." Matthew looked up at the policeman. "I'm sorry, sir. It's only that I've never sort of thought of ships being like people's houses. I'll remember what you said," and he held out his hand. They shook, seriously. "Come along now. We're late." "Thank you very much, Constable." The policeman grinned and raised his hand to his helmet again as we drove off. "What had you been doing?" I inquired. "What I said. Just looking," said Matthew. "Well, you were lucky. I only hope I am as lucky with the next policeman I should meet. An amiable man." "Yes," said Matthew. During the pause that followed, he became aware that another apology was due. "Sorry about being late, Daddy. I didn't notice the time." As if he felt more explanation was needed, he went on. "You see, Chocky's never seen a ship, not close to, I mean, so I was showing her. But a man put his head up through a hole and got angry and took me to the policeman." "Oh, I see. So it was really Chocky's fault." "Not really," Matthew said fairly. "I mean, I thought she'd be interested." "It seems to me more likely that if she was running true to form, she'd think ships are silly." "Well, she does, rather," Matthew admitted. "She said it must waste an awful lot of power to keep on pushing all that water out of the way, and wouldn't it be more sensible, if you have to have ships, to build them to just go above the water, and have only to push air out of the way?" "Well, she's a bit late on that one. You tell her we have hovercraft already," I suggested, as we arrived back at our bathing place and the waiting Mary and Polly. During the following week, I felt even more glad that Landis was coming down the next Sunday. For one thing, Matthew's school report arrived. While on the whole it was not unsatisfactory, I detected a slightly puzzled air about parts of it. Mr. Trimble acknowledged that Matthew had made progress, of a kind, but felt that he was capable of doing much better if he could confine his attention to the orthodox forms of mathematics. Miss Toach, while she was glad to record that his interest in her subject had sharpened considerably, thought he would do better to concentrate on geography at present and let cosmography come later. Mr. Caffer, the physics master, was not entirely pleased. He wrote, "There has been a marked difference in his approach this term. If it were to show itself less in a capacity to ask questions and more in ability to absorb information, this work would improve." "What have you been doing to Mr. Caffer?" I asked. "He gets annoyed," said Matthew. "There was one time when I wanted to know about the pressure of light, and another time when I told him I can see what gravity does, but I don't see why it does it. I don't think he knows why, and there were some other things too. He wanted to know where I was getting the questions from. I couldn't very well tell him they came out of things Chocky had told me, so he got a bit riled. But it's all right now. I mean, it's not much good asking him things, so I haven't any more." "And then there's Miss Blade, biology. She seems to be a bit sniffy, too," I said. Oh, I expect that's because I asked her how people who had only one sex managed to reproduce. She said, well, everybody had only one sex, and I said what I meant was one kind of person, all alike, not different like men and women. She said that could be in some plants, but not in people. And I said not always, and she said nonsense. But I said it wasn't nonsense because I happened to know someone like that. And she said, what did I mean, in that kind of voice. Then I saw it had been dim of me to ask at all, because I couldn't tell her about Chocky, so I shut up, although she kept on wanting to know what I meant. And ever since then she sometimes looks at me very hard. And that's all, really. Miss Blade was not the only one to feel baffled. A little time before, trying to get some idea what type of mental projection this Chocky was, I had asked, doesn't Chocky have a home? Doesn't she even tell you about her mother and father and where she lives, that kind of thing? Not much, said Matthew. I can't make out what it's like. You see, such a lot of the things she says don't mean anything. I said I was afraid I didn't quite see. Matthew had frowned in concentration. Well, I suppose I was quite deaf, and you tried to tell me about a tune. I wouldn't be able to know what you were talking about, would I? It's a bit like that. Sort of, I think. She does sometimes talk about her father, or her mother, but the hims and hers get mixed up as if they were both the same. I wondered what complex we were on the brink of now, and tried to recall the name of some suitably gynandrous Greek, but it eluded me. I said merely that it must be confusing. Matthew agreed. But our way is difficult for her to understand too, Matthew told me. She thinks it must be terribly confusing to have two parents, and not a good idea at all. She says it is natural and easy to love one person, but if your parent is divided into two different people, it must be pretty difficult for your mind not to be upset by trying not to love one more than the other. She thinks it's very likely the strain of that which accounts for some of the peculiar things about us. This reportage of Chocky's ideas gave me some sympathy with Miss Blade's bewilderment. It also made me thankful that I had already approached Landis, though at the same time my anxiety over his verdict was somewhat sharpened. The next thing was that Mary's sister Janet rang up and gave her usual short notice of intention to pay us a visit over the weekend. Mary explained that we were engaged on Sunday and fended off inquiries as to the exact nature of the engagement. "Oh, well, too bad, but never mind," said Janet. "We can easily make it Friday and leave on Sunday directly after breakfast. I'll give us a chance of seeing more of the country on the way home." "Damn," said Mary as she hung up. "The trouble with Janet is that when she makes up her mind, it just scatters my wits. Why on earth didn't I put her off until next weekend? Oh well, too late now." God, that's loud.